about my childhood. Did we discuss when I broke my arms?
No, you didn't.
Well, my father had a garage in the back of our house, and it wasn't a high garage. It was probably an 8 or 9 foot garage with a slope for the water to run off. So for some reason, the kids in the alley, kids I played with, we lived up on the street. There were some who lived in the alley. They were jumping off this roof, and they were jumping into our backyard, which was on dirt. You understand what I'm saying? They didn't jump on the alley side that was paved. So there was a girl named Virginia Shipley, and she was teasing me that I was afraid to jump because I wouldn't jump, because my dad said, don't go up on that roof. And whenever I didn't listen to my dad, I always got in trouble. So she kept teasing me to jump off the roof. So I got up there and I looked down, and it looked like it was about 500 feet. It was probably about 8 feet. I was frightened. I don't know how old I was, 6 years old, I think. So I started to jump, and I didn't jump out far enough from the edge of the garage, and I caught my heel in the spouting that ran across. It was open spouting, and that tipped me forward, and I landed on my arms, and I broke both of my arms at the same time.
Ooh.
So Mother came home, and Nettie was watching this, and so Nettie ran home and got 2 of my father's handkerchiefs, and so she tried to bandage each of my wrists with the handkerchief. So my mother came home and saw what happened, and she gave Nettie a little bit of a whipping. Not bad, but she blamed it on Nettie. It wasn't Nettie's fault, as I did it, not Nettie. But anyway, my mother was so upset she was going to blame somebody, and she couldn't blame Virginia Shipley. So she gave Nettie a swat or 2. They took me to Dr. Earl Phillips, and he said he couldn't do it in the office, so they took me to the Ohio Valley General Hospital, and they set my arms under fluoroscope. You talk about radiation, it wasn't X-ray, he had lead gloves on, I guess, I don't remember, and I had 2 nurses holding me down, and he manipulated the bones into position, and then he put a cast on my arm, each one, and he did a phenomenal job because I never had any limitation of movement. A lot of times in those days, kids would break their arm, and then after that, it would never be straight. Their wrists wouldn't be right, like it wasn't attached properly, or the thumbs didn't work right. But I mean, he got my arms just fine. But it was quite an experience, and I remember walking home, and I had a splint on each arm, and my mother was crying. She was so upset, and it really hurt. I mean, I can't tell you how much that hurt under no anesthesia, nothing, just manipulation. But anyway, once I got home, then I was the center of attention, and my arms were like this. Everyone was favoring me, wanting to feed me. I was spoiled enough before this. And, that made it worse. Anyway, I had, I think the casts were supposed to be on 6 weeks. The casts were like, I think, as I remember, like an aluminum splint down the length of my arm, and then I think it was taped very tightly. It wasn't a plaster cast like you see on broken legs and things. But anyway, it was really restrictive. After a day or 2, first I was in like a sling, but I took the sling off, and then I could move my arms a little bit. There were, I didn't have any strength in them, but I could pick up things, So anyway, after about 4 or 5 weeks, we went back to Dr. Phillip, and he put his scissors under the tape, and I remember he cut it, and freed my arms, and they went like that. You know, they were so weak.
Atrophy, yeah.
Yeah, you know. But anyway, after a few days, I got my strength back, you know. And, you know, walking home, my mother's crying again, you know. You know, it's a burden to be the only boy in two families. You know, everyone looked to me, you know. So anyway, I mean, it worked out all right. And it was my fault. And Nettie, to this day, talks about she got the whipping.
Oh, boy.
That was my third sets of broken arms. When I was 4 years old, I was riding a wagon down the street, and the wagon tipped over, and it fell on me, and it broke my right wrist then. That was the first time. And they set it, and I mean, it healed all right. So you might say I've had 3 broken arms, and that's all. After that, I never had anything wrong.
So you had the first one with the wagon, the second one
Yeah,
with
second one
jumping.
when I jumped off the
When
roof.
was the third?
When I jumped off the roof, I broke both of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right. Okay.
that was the 3. That was the 3. When I was, I don't know, 5 or 6, they lined all of us up, and they took us to the hospital, and they took out our tonsils.
For no
all
reason.
5 of us. And in those days, it was done, I would say, prophylactically. They thought that would, you know, prevent sore throats and things like that. Nowadays, the philosophy is altogether different.
Right.
And they believe you should keep that because that's part of the lymphatic system. But they took us all to the hospital, took us all to the operating room, and the anesthesia was drip ether, and that wasn't fun. They put over your face, it looked like a small strainer. You know how you'd strain something at the sink? It was like a small strainer with a cloth on it. And they strapped you down, and they put this little cloth strainer over your mouth and nose and dripped ether into it. And you know, you fought and fought and fought, and there was no oxygen to speak of. Everything that you were inhaling was the drip ether, and it knocked you out finally. You know, it was really crude, you know, but I mean, it got the job done. And we all had our tonsils taken out, and you know, then they gave us a small dish of ice cream. You know, that was supposed to be the healing part of it. And I know medically it was the wrong thing to do, but none of us after that time ever had any throat problems. I mean, we just, all 5 of us were healthy. And I know medically it's probably not right. And once in a while when you'd have a sore throat, they'd take you to the ear, nose, and throat man. At that time, the specialty was eyes, ears, nose, and throat, all 4. After that, they broke eyes off separately to ophthalmology. But anyway, we went to a physician. He had a long wire with like a large cotton ball at the end, and he'd dip it, I think, in tincture of merthiolate or tincture of iodine. I don't know which one. You'd open your mouth, he'd get it way back on the posterior wall of your pharynx and rub it around. You're choking, you're gagging, you know, it's burning. And, you know, that was the state of the art in medicine.
Right.
I mean, you know, that's just the way it was, but somehow, you know, we were all healthy after that. We were all healthy.
So, tell me about your dad.
Well, my dad was he was quite a man. You know, my father was so poor when he was young, you know, and he only had a year and a half of education in Lebanon. That's all, a year and a half. I think the teacher accused him of something, and my dad said he didn't do it. And the teacher gave him a beating, literally a beating in class. And my dad went home and never went back to school. So you know, he came to this country and he taught himself how to speak English, how to read and write. I don't know how he did it. And even when I was in school and I would have problems like in math and in algebra, he could solve them in his head, but he couldn't tell me how. But he could get the answer. I mean, he was a remarkable man. He had sort of photographic memory. You know, he would study the stock book at that time. We had a Standard and Poor book, a small book, you know, and all of the standard data would be on that for the major corporations. My dad would study that book, and you'd ask him about a company, and he could pretty much tell you the capitalization. He'd tell you what was the low or the high for the year, and how many shares they had, and how much money they made last year, or for the last 5 years. It would be in the book. You know, they had like a 5-year running thing, and I mean, he could just, I don't know how he did it, but he could. I couldn't do that. And I think if my dad had the education I had, there's no telling what he would have done. You know, I know what he did with the little bit he had. It was an interesting thing that happened with Nettie. Nettie, across the street from where we lived was the orphanage. And it was really where the nuns lived. You know, it was the nunnery where they lived. And the children in the orphanage went to school with us at St. Alphonsus, so we knew them all. And Nettie was over there playing with a couple little girls her age that she went to school with. And the orphanage had a high wall, like 6 or 8 feet tall, but it had, you know, an open door. The door would open and close, but it was never locked. So these boys, Francis Weber and Billy Habig and his brother, they went in and began throwing snowballs at the girls and really hitting them. You know, sometimes, you know, a snowball, when snow first comes down, it's pretty light. But if the snow starts to melt a little bit, it gets a lot of water in it. And then the snowball's like a baseball.
Sure, it's hard.
You get hit in the face with it, it'll knock you down. Well, these boys were throwing these, you know, and these girls are helpless against them. They were older boys. They were 3, 4 years older. And I don't know why they were picking on these girls, you know. So Nettie came home crying. And my dad said, "What happened?" And she told him. So my dad went down and he grabbed two of those boys by the arm. And he said, if you ever do this again, I'll break your arm. Both of you. And this one boy said, "I'm going to go home and get my dad." And my father said, "You go and get him and I'm going to break his arm." When my dad got angry, everybody backed up. I can only tell you, when he became angry, you knew it. And nobody challenged him. Well, you know, that boy's father never came around, but his mother called the police. And so, you know, a policeman came to the door and said, "Mr. Shy, what happened?" And my dad told him. And the policeman said, "Mr. Shy, you know, you don't want to get in trouble." My dad said, "I don't want any trouble. But those boys are not going to hurt my daughter and those other little girls, you know. They're not going to do that. You know, you go and tell them to behave themselves." He said, I'm here reading the newspaper. I'm not looking for trouble." And that was the end of it. But, you know, those boys never bothered Nettie again. They never bothered Nettie again. I mean, when my dad told you something like that, and his father never came around, my dad would have made mincemeat out of him.
Was your dad a pretty big guy?
He was 5'11", but he was probably 5'11", 185. But I don't know how to tell you. He was strong, phenomenally strong. When he first came to this country, you know, he was 16 years old. He went to work for Wheeling Steel, and his job was lifting steel plates, and the plates were 80 or 90 pounds each, you know, and you were lifting them all day long. And the men at Wheeling Steel told my dad, they said, "Look, you need to get out of here. Otherwise, after a few years, your back is going to be broken like our backs are." But I mean, my dad could do that. I mean, he was strong. So, you know, I never saw my dad in a fight. Never. But, you know, you could only go so far against him. You couldn't push him. And you know, there was nobody who was going to bother his family. He would, you know, you'd fight for your daughter.
Sure.
You'd fight for Claire Marie. I tell you, there's nobody going to hurt her if you're living.
Right.
That's right. And that's the way my father felt. You know, the girls were innocent. They were just playing.
Right.
You know. So I mean, that's the way it was.
So you want to tell the story about going up to the thing in Canada and leaving Mildred and Eddie?
Well, my father made a pledge. You know, I always make pledges. When I was, our family never went on vacations per se. You know, we didn't go to resorts. You know, we didn't go to visit cities and go to hotels. What we would do, we would go to religious shrines. I mean, my father and mother were very religious, my aunt and my uncle too. So in the summer, you know, we would go to Carriahia where there was there was a religious convocation around the Assumption, you know, August 15th. And, but anyway, I think my father made a pledge that if I were born a boy, that he would take me to St. Anne de Beaupré Church in Canada, in Quebec. So, in those days, the cars were small. I mean, you could squeeze 5 people in them, you know, or maybe 6, but it was tight. And there wasn't much luggage space. That's the thing, you know, you could put couple suitcases. Anyway, in order to go to Canada, it would be my uncle, my aunt, and Paula. I mean, that was the big 3. They were always together. And then it had to be my father, my mother, and I, because I was the occasion for going. So it could take the girls, you know. So the girls stayed at the orphanage. But, you know, it wasn't like they were abandoned or anything. I mean, they stayed, and I stayed at the orphanage myself once or twice, when my parents had to go out of town or something. Because you were safe there, the nuns took care of you. The boys slept in one section, the girls slept in another. I mean, you know, but anyway, Nettie to this day complains that she was left behind at the orphanage because she didn't get to go to Canada. And I guess she was, you know, but I mean, that was the best they could do. I mean, they just couldn't do it any better. And I was, because I lived across the street from the nuns at where their residence was, they used to have a 5:30 mass for the nuns before they would go over to St. Alphonsus School. And so a lot of times they would ask me to be the altar boy because I just lived across the street. And especially if there were a lot of snow, some of the other altar boys that lived 4 or 5 blocks away at 5:30 in the morning, they would be breaking through the snow.
Right.
And the snow might be knee deep, and I'm not exaggerating sometimes. I mean, that snow would come down. So I'd trudge across the street, and I'll never forget this one time. You know, in that period, you were fasting from midnight on. And of course, we didn't eat it in the evening. We ate at 8, 12, and 5. So, you know, I mean, we'd eat our supper at 5 and we'd be done at 5:20, you know, 5:30 at the most. So, you know, by the next morning, you know, I hadn't eaten in 10 hours. So I'm serving this one time, you know, and it's cold. I'm sleepy, and all of a sudden, I had a wave of nausea that would just almost knock me over. I don't know, I got so sick, and I went up to the priest who was serving the mass. I said, "Father, I'm really sick," and he said, "Don't faint. Go in the sacristy and lie down." So I went off the altar, went in the sacristy, and I laid down flat, you know, which is the right thing to do until my head cleared. You know, it took maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and I was okay. And then went back and finished the mass. 40 years later, I'm the lector at St. Austin's on a big feast day, and there were, 3 priests and 15 altar boys and on the altar. And I saw this one boy's eyes start to roll, and the next thing I know, he was fainting, and I caught him. I mean, as a lector, so I caught him and sort of eased him into the sacristy and laid him out. And went back on the altar, and another boy faints. Right in the middle of this big service. I caught him, took him in and laid him out, That was the end of the fainting. But I mean, if I didn't catch these kids, I don't know, sometimes when, somebody falls, people just stand there and look at it.
Right.
They don't know what to do.
Sure.
My father would usually go to either 5:30 morning mass or 7 o'clock morning mass. And the altar boys used to wear a black cassock and a white surplice they called it. Well, this one early mass, the people would kneel at the altar for communion. That was the old days before Vatican II. You had to kneel down for communion. And laymen didn't touch the host. Okay? So as the priest and the altar boy are coming across the altar railing up and down the row giving communion, there were some votive lights, vigil lights, candles. There was a stand of them. And there was somebody was kneeling in the edge, so the boy was ahead of the priest, going this way, and his surplice got in a flame, and he caught on fire. And he didn't notice it first. It just first started. They started back across. The priest noticed it, and the priest froze. He has a chalice in his hand, ciborium, with a host, like he's going to give a host to, and he don't know what to do. Here's this boy's in flames.
Right.
He's got the host and the ciborium. And my dad is there. He sees this thing, and he takes like 5 giant steps, reaches over the altar rail and grabs that boy, and grabs that surplice and rips it off of him, and throws it on the ground and steps on it. And everyone is standing there, frozen. I don't know what would have happened to that boy. My dad reacts fast, and I do too. Claire doesn't. That's why when the kids were choking, Claire would when Jessica was young, she was always choking on a little bit of food. And Claire would start screaming and hand me the baby and run upstairs, and sometime I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know the baby was choking. I might have been looking over here, and Jessica's choking over here. All of a sudden I got Jessica in my hand and Claire's running up the stairs. Well, in this case, my dad with 4 or 5 giant steps, and he thought he saved that boy from getting burned.
Sure.
That boy, that surplice was burning like that because some of the surplices were cotton, and they were thick, and some of the surplices were like lace. You know how a woman's mantilla is, that type of lace? Some of them were like that. And they were starched, and they really would burn. So that's the one that this boy had on. It wasn't like a heavy T-shirt.
Right.
So that's the way that's the way it was.
Any other memories about your dad you want to share?
It were just things that I think of. The last night I was home before I left to go to Newfoundland. I'd been in the Air Force for 3 weeks down in Alabama, and I came home for a few days, and then I was getting ready to leave again. This time I was going to Newfoundland. I was going to be gone for at least 6 months or a year. I don't remember exactly. So my dad's sitting there, and he's playing solitaire, And I'm sitting by him and we're talking a little bit and he's playing solitaire. He's sad, I'm sad, you know. We're not saying too much about what I'm gonna do. You know, even though I was 26 years old, you know, it was really you know, you're going into service. It's not like going to college.
Right.
You know, and you're going overseas, even if it's a part of Canada, but it's still overseas. And I don't know, he played solitaire for about an hour and a half, then he said, I guess we better go to bed. And we went to bed, and the next morning he drove me to Pittsburgh, and I caught the plane to go to New York, and then to New Jersey. And when I was in service, I wrote home about once a week, once every 2 weeks. Not a long letters, but just letting them know I was okay. In those days, a phone call was a big deal. You know, it wasn't like it is now. So, you know, I'd write them, and my dad was the one who would write, not my mother. He would always write.
So the table that you guys were at playing solitaire, was that the table we have in our house now? The dining room table?
Yeah, that's the one. It wasn't uncovered. You know, my mother had a tablecloth on it. And we didn't use that for eating. We would eat in the kitchen. We would eat like a Sunday meal or a feast day meal, Christmas or Easter on that. You know, Mother would set it for that. But the rest of the time, it would just be covered and we'd read the newspaper on it. I'd study on it, you know, do my homework on it, things like that.
So when the leaves aren't in it,
It was quite a bit smaller.
Yeah, and it has that little ledge. I guess he used to put cards on that ledge.
Yeah, you could do it underneath. Yeah. And across the hall, I mean, when first we lived in an apartment for a while, and across the hall was this apartment of these two elderly ladies and their brother. And one was Nora, and one was Mrs. Sylvie, and the brother was named Rob. He had never married, Nora had never married. Mrs. Sylvie had worked for a physician in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, and when she was like the housekeeper, and then when his wife died, this physician married her, and then later on he died, and then they moved back to Wheeling, where she moved back to Wheeling where her brother and sister lived, and she had a couple little pieces of property that she got her rent from. And so at the time, I think her rent for that apartment was like $30 a month. It was like 5 rooms, a bathroom, kitchen. Anyway, one day she told my father, she said, Mr. Shaw, I don't have any money to pay you. And he said, why not? And she said, I'm not getting any money anymore from Sharpsburg. Every month they write me and tell me that the expenses are more than the rent they're getting. And my dad said, well, tell me about these properties and give me the address and let me go up and look at them. So my dad went up, and then he went up to see the real estate man taking care of him. My dad felt like they were cheating her. So he said, we're taking this over. We want you out of this. So then my dad began to go up there maybe once every 2 or 3 months whenever he needed to, say, do a repair. He could do a little bit of repair, a little bit of this and that, you know. And there was a man in the Knights of Columbus named McGuigan. He was an Irishman. And he wasn't working. My dad said, McGuigan, do you want to go with me to Sharpsburg? And my dad told him what he wanted to do. McGuigan said, I'll go with you, Shia, but you have to start the day on your knees. In other words, you had to go to Mass. So I think that was when my dad began going to Mass every morning. I think before that, I don't know if he went every morning. But this was like in the 30s. I mean, it was a long time, you know. So they began going up and taking care of the property and getting it straightened out and trying to get a little rent for this, because this lady was taking care of herself, Nora and Rob. So they were elderly, you know, they were probably in their 80s. Rob had had a stroke, and he would play solitaire all day long, and it would be on a dining room table, and he had a piece of brown, like wrapping paper, so he wouldn't wear out the tablecloth. You know, people were practical in those days. They didn't wear out things. So, you know, he would play solitaire on this piece of paper, and he couldn't shuffle because of this stroke, you know. I mean, he just couldn't shuffle the cards. He'd just sort of just keep on playing, you know. I don't even know if he knew hardly what the cards were. So I would go over there, which was sort of across the hall, and I would shuffle the cards for him if I were there. You know what I mean? I couldn't shuffle very well, but I'd do it a little bit better than he could. And if my mother and I were going uptown, she would send me over with a comb, and they would comb my hair for me. I don't know why they liked to do it. They'd put a lot of water in my hair, and they'd comb it, you know, and sometimes they'd part it down the middle. I don't know what I looked like, but they'd say, now you look like a little gentleman, you know. I can remember going across the hall with my comb, and they would comb my hair. So my dad took care of these three, you know, and he made sure that the money took care of them. I don't know how he did it. Maybe he paid it. I don't know. He never said he did, but I can't believe he. I think finally, when the war started, when World War II started, he sold the properties, and then he got, you know, a corpus of money.
Right.
He got a lump, and it may have been a couple $1,000 because nothing was much then. But at least it wasn't like the monthly rent that they never got.
Right.
So my dad managed that for him. And first Rob died, and you know, they buried him. They did what they had to do. And then Nora died, and finally Mrs. Sylvie died. Well, when they needed, they couldn't go out. They couldn't even walk up and down the stairs. So if they needed something from the store, they'd send me to the store, and they'd give me a penny or a nickel. You know, they'd want to give you something. They just didn't want to do it for free. And I know in our house we always used butter, but they would use margarine. And in those days, the margarine, there was a law against coloring it. The butter lobby, I think, was pretty strong, and they didn't want the margarine to be colored to look as nice as butter. So the margarine looked white, but there was a little capsule that came along with the margarine, and you'd put that, it was a coloring agent, a food coloring. You'd put that in the middle of it, and then you'd squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it, and then it would take on a yellow color. So they would ask me to do that because they were so arthritic. You know, and I'd squeeze it, you know, and I think, I wonder why they have to do this, because our butter's yellow already. I didn't realize, you know, that they were trying to conserve their money. So they had some relatives in Wheeling, and a few of them would come and visit, but most of them wouldn't. Most of them, you know, the people were elderly. They didn't want to be imposed on. You know how it is.
Right.
I mean, you know, you either have it in your heart for take care of, you know, helpless people, or you don't.
Right.
Well, anyway, when Mrs. Sylvie died, then a lot of them came around to get some money. You know?
Really?
Yes, yes. And my dad didn't take too kindly to that, and he just picked them out and said, "You out of here. Don't ever come back. You never came around when they were living. You get nothing." And whatever was left, he gave it to the 2 or 3 relatives that had come around and had done a little bit for him. But I mean, I don't know if they had wills. I don't know how legally they did it, but my dad did it that way. You know, and he chased the rest of them out in no uncertain terms. And I can imagine what my dad said, because he was a man of few words with people like that. So, I mean, he took care of those people, and he got them through their, you know, I remember when, I think when Rob had another stroke, my dad went and got Dr. Phillips, the one that delivered me. I don't know if I told you this. I jump around. I was circumcised on the ironing board.
Really?
That's what my mother told me one time. So for what it's worth, you know, I was born at home.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I was born. James, in those days you weren't born in a hospital. You were born at home.
Wow.
I'm just telling you. So I was born at home, and later on, I don't know, years later, my mother said, somehow she laughed, she said, you were circumcised on the ironing board. So, for what it's worth. Anyway, Rob, I think, had a stroke, and my dad went and got Dr. Phillips, and Dr. Phillips came, you know, and he examined him, and he said to my dad, he said, Mr. Shire, there's nothing I can do for him. He's going to die in a day or two. Just make him comfortable. So that's what they did, and then he died. And, you know, they all died at home, you might say, in the apartment. My dad got them all through, got them all buried, you know, and everything. He took care of them. But my mother had a bunch of ladies that she was friendly with, you know, and there was one named Mrs. Amon. She was a nice little lady. She had one son. I think her husband was an alcoholic. He mistreated her. She had one son. It was the light of her life. He was killed in an auto accident, I think. And she had a terrible time. She built a mausoleum for him at the cemetery. It was a separate building.
Wow.
You know, separate. She took all of her money that she had. I think she borrowed against her house even to get enough money to build this. And she would go out to the cemetery every day and stay there all day long in there. And when the cemetery people finally realized what she was doing, they wouldn't let her do that, and they locked it. They put a lock on it, said, you can't do this. You can come and visit, but you can't stay here 8 or 10 hours, because they were afraid that she would commit suicide or do, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was, in other words, no matter how great your grief, how deep your grief is, you've got to get over it. Right. And you can't get over it by sitting on a grave. You can't, you know. So, I mean, you know, they did that later on, I think, when she settled down a little bit and got over it. I mean, they gave her maybe access to it, but they just wouldn't let her do that. I don't know, it seemed like when I was growing up, it was just death all around me. I mean, you know, accidental death and then military deaths. There was a very prominent family in Wheeling. They were Lebanese people, they were very wealthy, and they had one son. And he went to Lindsley Military Academy, which was a very expensive private school, and had a little bit of a military education along with it. And then he went into service in around the middle of World War II. He went in. He was old enough to go, and he went in, and he was stationed down in north of South Carolina, somewhere in there. And the sergeant or whoever was in charge of his group was mistreating one of the draftees, beating him up. You know, they could do anything in those days. You know, there wasn't any comeback. Mm-hmm. They could just do anything. Well, he was beating this guy, beating him, and this NASA boy said, "Look, I went to a military academy. I know that you're not allowed. You're not supposed to do this." And this guy took a gun and shot him.
Really?
And killed him on the spot. And the woman's name, I don't know her first name, but she was so bright, so intelligent. They called her Sharpie. Her name was, and their last name was Nassif. They had a candy company. They called her Sharpie, and this boy's name was Joe Nassif. And they couldn't even find out what happened to him. All they knew was that he died. And they tried to cover it up in the military. Well, they went to Washington, and I guess they went to a congressman and a senator and told the story and demanded to know at least what happened to their son. So they launched an investigation, and they found out he was shot by, you know, the man above him. It was just a sergeant or something, and I don't know if they ever did anything to that man or not. I mean, but I mean, they killed that boy. That was the only child they had. It wasn't the only boy they had. It was the only child they had. And it took her a long time to get over that. After that, she began doing a lot of volunteer work for the Red Cross and things like that. They were wonderful people. That was a terrible thing that happened, you know. He didn't even die in combat. What a way to die. I mean, it would just seem like it was death all around me. At least it seemed like every year there was somebody. And I don't know why.
Death all around you and then growing up in the Depression.
I'm telling you. And I don't know why, but you know, of course, once the war started, there was death all around. I mean, just every couple months, every 3 to 6 months, there was somebody. Of the group I knew, I'm not talking about Wheeling as a whole. I'm just talking about the group I knew. There was a lot of sadness. And you know, the women, when they had a death in the family, most of them, now not Mrs. Nassif, but most of the older women wore black for the rest of their lives. Especially like if their husband died.
Really? For the rest of their life?
They'd wear black.
Are you talking every single day? Or
Every day. That's all they would wear. I mean, I can name a dozen of them. And their husbands got killed. They wore black. There was a family that lived down in the alley in a tenement, about a half a block from where I lived. And they had a number of children. And their father worked down on the first level in a store. And somebody went into that store at night, and he went down hearing the noise, and they shot and killed him. I don't know why, you know. And Mrs. Bryce was a widow at that point. And she had 3 or 4 children. One boy was in class with me, one boy was behind me, 2 girls were ahead of me, I think, with about 5 children. The boy behind me became a priest, and at least one of the girls became a nun, and that lady lived to be about 105 years old. They eventually moved to Washington, D.C., because the boy in my class, I think, went to work for the CIA.
Interesting.
CIA, because he knew a little bit of Arabic, not much, but I think when he went into the CIA, they taught him, and he learned it, and he spent his whole career in the Middle East, and he never told me that he worked for the CIA, but he told me one time he had to go into a mosque for some reason. He said, if I would have been discovered as a Christian, as a Catholic, he said they would have killed me on the spot. And he had to go in, so I think it was doing some kind of government work. But, you know, even with a lot of tragedy, those families turned out well. So, you know, there were no drugs. There were, I mean, with people was seeing stuff like this, there wasn't alcoholism. I mean, you would think like somebody who would lose their only child in the family, they'd go to pieces. Well, they did. But they got over their grief, and they didn't go to drugs. They didn't go to alcohol. You know, they came out of it. So when people say they can't handle the stress, that's foolishness. You make up your mind. You can do what you make up your mind to do. Because the things that happen to these people, I mean, there was a lady that lived about 2 blocks from me, and dirt poor wasn't the adjective. That's how poor they were. as far as I know, those boys had one set of clothes. And she would wash those clothes, the father was dead, and she wore black for about 70 years, because she lived to be 105, Mrs. Murad. I think she would wash those clothes at night at the sink, squeeze them out, and hang them in front of an open gas flame, you know, like a little burner type flame. That's the kind of things they had then. They didn't have central heat. You know, you'd have a little burner, which was carbon monoxide and everything else. But I think when those boys needed their clothes, maybe you should wash a different one every night, you know, because she didn't wash every night. Nobody washed their clothes every day. But when they needed it to be done, I mean, that's the way she did. And she had a son that was killed in service. She had about 5 boys, and the youngest was severely handicapped. And the one was killed in the service, and the other 3, you know, they became like truck drivers or postal mailmen, but they were honorable. They were good people. I mean, just the salt of the earth. And they married and had families, and the youngest, Georgie, was the handicap. He lived with his mother, and she took care of him, and then when she got old, he took care of her, and she lived literally to be 105, and she had her mind right out to the end. Yeah.
She stayed in Wheeling the entire time?
Oh yeah. I mean, I doubt if she ever left Wheeling. They were poor people. They didn't travel. I mean, you know, during the Depression, people didn't travel a lot. You took money to travel. I mean, $20, $30, $50 was a lot of money. It was a lot of, if you know, when wages were $1 an hour, you know, $40 a week. I remember my father and mother, my father and uncle, we would drive out to Wheeling Park. There were 2 major parks in Wheeling, Wheeling Park, Ogilvie Park. Wheeling Park was on the flat level. Ogilvie Park was up in the hills. We're going out to Wheeling Park. My uncle pointed out to my father a brick home. It was yellow brick on a great big lot. The lot was probably 2 or 3 acres on National Road, what they called it. And my uncle said, that house was $40,000. And that was a lot of money. And that house was like a 3-story brick house with a basement. I mean, it'd be $1 million house today. But I mean, you know, $40,000 was a lot of money at that time. You know, life wasn't all sadness. You know, I mean, we did crazy things, and you know, but I mean, there were, you know, when you're young, you don't deal with death. You know, the older people deal with death.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? You know, the older people are the ones who go to the funeral home, go to the rosaries, go to the burials. You know, the kids are in school, and you're playing. You know, you don't do all that. But I know it happened. I know it happened all around me.
Did your dad ever come here to this house?
Oh yeah.
So they would come and visit after you guys were married? And
yeah. Even though my dad thought it was a mistake to buy this house, once we bought it, he came and stayed here.
Why do you think it was a mistake?
Because it was too far from Nettie and Mildred, and it wasn't in Enfield, at Terrytown. I mean, you know, my mother was very upset. She thought, oh, you can't live over there. It's too far away, too far from Nettie. You know. No, they really liked it here. Once I bought the house and got the downstairs bedroom for them and a bathroom on the first floor, and at that time we had a bathtub because they like to take a bath. That's the reason I didn't put a shower in downstairs when I first bought the house. So, and they stayed with us a lot. Then they liked the house.
Well, if they were so impressed by the 2 or 3 acres with the big brick house for $40,000, you know,
well, but
how many acres you have here in this house?
No, that was a grand home. You know, Wheeling had a, a group of people, you know, for want of a better term, they were the old money people. And they were people that had businesses, they were educated, maybe they had been in this country for, you know, 2 or 3 generations. So they, you know, they had something to build on, you know what I mean? And there was a very wealthy group of people, because Wheeling was an industrial city. So you had executives from Wheeling Steel, Wheeling Stamping, you know, the glass companies, the coal mines. I mean, there was a lot of money in Wheeling. I mean, our generation was, you might say, the next wave that came over. These people would be the English people and the German people that came over maybe 50 or 60 or 80 years earlier.
Right.
So they were several generations ahead of us. And they're the ones that sort of enjoyed the economic boom that took place right before the war and then during World War II, when, you know, you had full employment, everything was working, everything, you know, things were scarce, you could sell everything that you got.
Sure.
It didn't matter, you know, things were rationed, but every once in a while, you know, you might get in a case of this or 3 dozen of that. It didn't matter, whatever it was, you know, you'd put it in a window and you'd sell it out in no time, because everything was scarce.
How did they keep inflation from happening? Or did it happen?
No, it didn't happen during the war, because everything was rationed. And, you know, the government would not allow you to raise the price just because an item was scarce. Like, Nettie worked at Stone and Thomas, which was like the equivalent of Foley's or Dillard's, okay? And one day there was a rumor that they were going to get in some nylon hosiery. During the war, there wasn't nylon, because nylon was used in parachutes. So nylon was really scarce. During the war, women would paint their legs with some kind of a coloring material, and it looked like they had hosiery, so that they wouldn't be white-legged.
Right.
You know what I mean? But this one day, Stone and Thomas got the hosiery in. And I mean, they sold it to, you know, first come, and I mean, you know, I think every woman in Wheeling lined up to get it. But they didn't charge 10 times more for it, even though they could have. They sold it for like a standard price. It was
that
fair.
was just government regulated?
Well, yeah, because I think the government would have come after them. I think the government, you know, during, at the beginning of World War II, Truman was in the Senate, and he chaired a committee that looked into war profiteering, where these companies were cheating the government by overcharging them for war materials and things like that. And some of those people were put in jail. And so, you know, it was a very bad connotation to do something unpatriotic like that. And stores just didn't do that. I mean, when they would get something in, at least as I recall, they sold it at a fair price, you know. And they'd give each person one, you know. First person would buy 10. No,
Right.
You get one. Next one, you know. That's just the way it was.
So we talked about your dad a little. You want to talk about your mom?
I don't know. My mom, she managed pretty well, you know. I mean, it wasn't easy on her. You know, she was used to living in Austin with her family and all these relatives. And my dad marries her and takes her up to Wheeling. It's a totally different way of life and everything. But I mean, she managed okay. She was very efficient in her own way. And I mean, literally, we ate at 8, 12, and 5. And we didn't eat leftovers. My dad wasn't big on leftovers, you know, and she cooked. There was cooked meals. I think one Saturday evening sometime we would have sandwiches maybe. But all the other, you know, all the other suppers were cooked. And, you know, when we would come to Texas, you know, she would sort of have to round us up. You know, we'd want to sleep. My dad would want to get on the road. You know, it was a terrible trip in those days. You know, and we would come in the winter. you know, would come in the winter because that would make it easier for my mother to avoid 6 weeks of winter to get to Texas where the weather was nice. Well, you'd leave Wheeling and you'd have to hope that you wouldn't run into snow between Wheeling and Columbus, or Columbus or Indiana, you know, high Indiana, Illinois, you know. Sometimes you'd run into a blizzard.
You just pull off and
Well,
wait it out.
you'd pull off if you could. A lot of times there was no place to pull off. You know, you're on a narrow country road, cars coming both ways, you can't always pull off,
Right.
you know. But I mean, we managed it. And, you know, we made all those trips, and I don't think we ever had a flat tire, which is hard to believe because, you know, the equipment wasn't like it is now. You know, there was a tire and a tube, you know, it wasn't radials, steel belted radials or anything like that. But, you know, for my mother, she'd come down and she'd stay, you know, with her parents, and we'd stay about 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, I don't remember exactly. And then we'd go home. Then when we'd go home, it'd be like maybe late April, so the worst would be over. You know, if we come in February and go back in April. We drove a lot. And I remember the first time I turned 16, you know, my dad expected me to drive, and I wasn't that good of a driver, you know. It's one thing to drive in the city, you know, and you're driving 20 miles an hour. Okay, you're out on a highway, you know, you're going 60 or 70 miles an hour in this little car, and you're not very good at it, and, you know, you're trying to hold the road. My dad's hollering, "Hold on!" He'd be hollering, I'd be all over the place, and it seemed like, I don't know, maybe he did it, he knew the roads better. It seemed like he'd get the good roads. I'd get those narrow two-lane roads. And I remember the first time we came through Louisiana, you know, every year my dad would try a different way to see if we could pick up 2 or 3 hours of less driving. You know, we used to go from Wheeling over to St. Louis and then down through Oklahoma. And then later on we'd go through Memphis, Tennessee. You know, and then we just tried different ways. Well, this one time we went sort of straight south and then over through Louisiana, had to drive through the whole state. And you talk about a minefield. It was a narrow 2-lane road, cars going both ways, nothing divided, and no shoulders. That's the thing, there were no shoulders.
Yeah.
And there was a drop-off of maybe 12 inches. And then there would be water along the road. And if you dropped off, and if you hit the axle, you'd break the axle.
Sure.
Because, you know, I mean, the drop-off was, sometime it would be 8 inches, sometime it would be 15 inches, you know, but there were no shoulders. So it was a terrible drive. And I mean, I'd drive, and I'd tell you, I'd have a stiff neck and everything else, because, I mean, that's the way it was.
Sure.
It was a terrible drive. And, you know, there'd be cars behind you and cars in front of you. And, you know, you're trying to make time. You know, you don't want to go 30 miles an hour. You'll never get there. So
Right.
my dad's saying, "Pass that car." I said, "Daddy, I can't see. Pass that car." I'm scared. I'm telling you. Scared. You know, that between 16 and 17 was a tough year. After that, I guess I learned how to drive, but that was a tough year. The roads were terrible. And you know, you'd hit Texarkana, you cross the line, and the road would open up. You were in Texas. It was always a good road, you know, it was night and day between Texas and Louisiana. And you see it today, how those people were treated
Right.
in New Orleans and how they're treated here. I mean, Louisiana has always been a democratic state. From, you know, Huey Long coming forward, And the money that should have been spent on public works was stolen, squandered, wasted. And so it was always behind. And they always treated the minorities bad. Ku Klux Klan and everything else. It was a terrible state. And it's still backwards.
Yeah.
It's still backwards. I mean, the North, my father always said, the best states are the ones where the political parties change every couple administrations, where you get a new party in and then they sweep with a clean broom, new broom. And even though he was a Republican, you know, it didn't upset him that there would be a Democratic administration in a state, because, you know, like the best states were Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, because the political parties went back and forth. The worst states, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, because they were all Democratic, you know, until into the 60s.
Right.
They were Democratic for 100 years. They were still getting over the Civil War and Reconstruction. And they were the worst states. They were always backwards. Always backwards. We used to go to Cary, Ohio. And Cary was a religious experience. I was very little. I didn't appreciate it. And when we were, this was a little town in Ohio that probably had 1,500 to 2,000 people in it. But around August the 15th, they'd have 20,000 people would go. And I don't know where they'd stay. A lot of them would stay miles away in hotels and motels. A lot of them would sleep in the cars. A lot of them would set up tents, things like that. Well, we used to go and we stayed with the nuns. They had a few rooms for rent that Uncle found out about it. We stayed with them. But one time on Friday, we ate the fish, and I don't know what happened, but we all got deathly sick on that fish. I guess the fish was spoiled. In those days, you know, you just didn't have refrigeration like you do now. But other than that, we never had any trouble with going to Cary. But I can remember my father having to carry every one of us kids upstairs. We were all too weak to walk upstairs. And after that, my parents would never have fish and milk or milk products at the same meal. Like fish and ice cream,
Right.
fish and milk, they never would. They blamed it because at that time I think we had fish and milk at that place. But anyway, at Cary, Ohio, you had all these ethnic groups that would come, and you would have they would march in procession at night with candles, and you would just, you know, you look, and every direction would be thousands of these little candles, people holding them, the wax running down and burning you, you know,
Right.
till they figured out to put a little paper. So you would have the Polish group, you'd have the Italian group, the German group, the Lebanese group. I mean, every ethnic group in the United States, I think, would be represented, and they would stick together, and they would march in this religious gathering, religious parade. And while they were marching, each group would sing in their native tongue. I tell you, it was a moving experience. And later on, well, this church was a huge church out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how they built this church in Cary, Ohio, but it became a shrine. And so people still go there, but it was a huge church. They had maybe a dozen altars in this church on 2 levels. They had the main altar, and then altars on left and right, and then on the back, left and right, and downstairs, left and right. And so at any one time, you might have a mass over here in German. This one might be in Italian. This one might be in Polish. You know what I mean? Or this is Lithuanian, you know. And I mean, it was quite an experience. Well, later on, they built a shrine almost out of town. They bought maybe 50 or 100 acres, and then they built another gathering place, church out there. And the groups would then make this march out there and back. And a lot of the women, I know Mrs. Beatrice from Wheeling, I remember she walked that barefooted because her son had cancer. His son was my age. Her son was my age, and he had cancer, and he was dying. She walked that, and it was paved part of the way, and the rest of the way wasn't paved. But the paved part had all these little stones. You know what I mean? Like our driveway.
Mm-hmm.
She walked that barefooted, which I would say it probably was 5 miles back, out and back. When she came back, I think her feet were bleeding. I mean, I saw examples of religious fervor I'll never forget. I'll never forget. And there was a Monsignor who came from Cleveland. His name was Monsignor Miffla, and he was saying a Malachite Mass. You know, even among the Lebanese, you know, there are Orthodox, there are Maronite, there are Malachite, there are different groups within the Catholic Church, within the umbrella of the church, because in foreign countries, it's not all Roman. You know, the Malachite Church is from the 1st century. It's before the Roman Church.
Mm-hmm.
So our church was really before the Roman Church. So there was a Mass being said in a little chapel. The main church was like over here, in a huge church. And then there was like a street that was closed off when all the people were there, because the people were walking back and forth all day long. And then across the street they had restrooms, they had a couple fountains, and then they had like an open pavilion where they sold religious articles, rosaries, prayer books, things like that, Bibles. And then next door there was a little wooden chapel. They would hold maybe, I don't know, 50 to 100 people, just a little chapel. And different groups would sign up to say a Mass in Italian, a Mass in Polish, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And this was in addition to the main church. Well, there was a Mass being said by Monsignor Miffla. And my father told him that he wanted me blessed. So I went up at the consecration. My dad said, "Go up." I said, "I don't want to." He said, "You go up." I went up through the altar railing. I knelt down, and Monsignor Miffla put the chalice on top of my head. And I guess he said a prayer, I don't know, as it was in Arabic. And then I walked out. I don't mean it to be funny. I often wonder if that blessing has protected me all my life. I am not kidding you. I can think of a half a dozen times when I could have been killed as well as not. I mean literally killed. A half a dozen times. And I think of that all the time when I walked up there and he put that chalice right on my head. And when Father Oliver said a Mass here, I told him to put the chalice on Ramona's head. It hasn't worked yet. But I did the best I could. But do you ever think of your life and how it could have happened worse? How maybe somebody interceded and got you going the right direction, or someone saved you, or someone went out of their way for you, or you made a decision. And I mean, I can think of a half a dozen times I could have been killed. When I was getting ready to go to Columbia in 1960, I went up to visit Dr. and Mrs. Pfluger. I had taken over his practice. Remember I told you about that. And then when I was coming back, I was driving down Lamar, and I was driving south on Lamar in the curb lane, and a car came from the other side and crossed the median, and he was going fast, and I was going sort of fast, and I saw him coming, and there was no way I could get out of there. I couldn't. And he hit me head on. I mean, absolutely head on. And I grabbed the steering wheel as tight as I could. There were no seat belts then. And I wrapped the steering wheel around the steering column, and my face hit the horn ring. There used to be a horn ring. It split my face, and that guy could have killed me. And that was just one of them. And he was almost dead. He was totally drunk. He had an open bottle in the car, I think. He was broke, judgment proof, no driver's license, no insurance. Just the worst kind of a person. And you know, I had USAA insurance, and they had to take care of all of my stuff because he had nothing. And on top of it, he goes from there to a veterans hospital in Temple. So we helped to pay for his recovery.
Sure.
And he almost died. I felt like killing him.
Yeah.
I was so angry with him. I was getting ready to go to Columbia, you know, like a few days later. And this happened to me. So they took me to Brackenridge. That was a trauma center then. And they said, "What doctor do you want?" I had read in the paper that there was a plastic surgeon that had come to town. There wasn't one before then, 1960. I said, "Give me that plastic surgeon that came to town. I don't know his name," and it was Frank Morris. And they called him, and he came. I didn't know him before that. After that, he and I became friends, and I did a lot of cleft palate work with him. I did on some of those babies. But anyway, he said, "You want me to put you to sleep?" I said, "No, just to get going." So he injected all around, and it looked like he had a suture about that long. He was going through my lip and going, you know, like that. And you know, I held still. I didn't move. You know, when I have to do it, I'll take it. I don't care what it is, because I know it's for my benefit. I didn't move, you know, and he sutured me up, and he did a great job. I mean, you can't even hardly tell. I mean, I was split right up, right in the middle. I was so angry at that guy for doing that. He's an absolute alcoholic. But anyway, he sewed me up, and then he gave me the name of a plastic surgeon in New York if I needed one, because I was leaving like about a week later, or maybe 3 or 4 days later. And I was fortunate that I got him. He and I became good friends after that.
So what about these other few times you almost got it?
I was driving to Pittsburgh, and my father had a new car. I was a student at Pitt, and I wanted to see how fast that car would go. And I turned a blind corner, and I was going 80. My fault, going about 80. And I turned a blind corner, and I see a large coal truck loaded with coal across 2.5 lanes of the highway. You understand? He's, you know, and I'm coming down, I think, and he's going up this hill, and he's straining because of the load.
Sure.
He's trying to get across the highway and get into the right lane to go this way. I'm coming down. I turn this corner and I see him, and there is no place for me to go. He's across 2.5 lanes. So I go off the highway, sort of up a hill. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Otherwise I hit him broadside.
Right.
You know, and I get bounced around and everything, but you know, I didn't get killed. I didn't hit anything bad. I mean, if I would have hit a post, if I would have hit a rock,
Tree.
I would have been dead.
Yeah.
And that could have easily happened. Could have easily happened. I mean, people were killed like that every day. And
Right,
it was my fault, it wasn't his fault.
right.
You know, I didn't anticipate a blind curve. When I was in Newfoundland, we were flying somewhere. I don't know, maybe I was coming back to the United States, but it was a prop plane. And, you know, there was a lot of turbulence, and I don't know why we took off, but we did. And we took off, and we couldn't get altitude. And every time we would get up about 1,000 feet, it was like a hand would slap the plane would free fall. I think we were hitting, I don't know, air currents, and the plane would free fall almost to the ground. And then we would, you know, start circling, you know, trying to gain altitude, and bam, down we would go again. And I didn't know whether we were going to get out of there alive. I mean, we must have got bammed down about 4 times. And you know, I think it was an open cockpit, and you know, on some of those military planes, they don't have cockpits that are closed.
Right.
They're open. You know, if
Right.
they're carrying passengers, say, people that are going to make a jump, you know, parachutes, you know, they would tell them when to jump and things like that, so it's wide open.
Right.
And I know that the pilot was sweating bullets just like the rest of us. Oh man, you know, I could have been killed a half a dozen times. And you know how things have worked out for me providentially.
Mhm.
With children and grandchildren, son-in-laws, and good son-in-laws.
Son-in-laws, yeah.
I'm very fortunate. I wouldn't trade any one of my son-in-laws. They're all different, they're all unique, and they're wonderful. They're almost more than I deserve.
So even the Democrat son-in-laws you wouldn't change?
No, Stan maybe I don't know, I don't talk politics. If I think somebody is a Democrat, I don't talk politics too much with
Yeah,
them.
I gotcha.
But I think, you know, I'm older now, and you gain a little perspective as you get older. You know, when you're younger, you think that all the bad things are happening just to me, and God has forgotten me, I'm on my own, and you say, you know, why me, Lord? I remember Jerry Lewis was complaining one time. He had, I think, 5 sons. One of them was sick, and he was complaining, God, you know, why are you doing this to me? I don't think the boy died, he was just sick, you know. And he's, you know, saying, God, how can you do this to me, you know? You know, who are we to ask God anything?
Jerry
And-
Lewis, the comedian?
Yeah, and he was complaining, I couldn't believe it in public, you know, on television, like God owed him a free pass through life and everything. Money, fame, family, everything. And you know, as you get older and you gain perspective, you know that there's hard times and tragedy in every family. I mean, it's just that most people take it and bear up with it and do the best they can with it. The crybabies, they never stop complaining. But most people just do the best they can, and they get along just fine. And as you get older, you realize that you've gotten more than your share in life. And you say, I wouldn't trade places with anybody.
Yeah.
I wouldn't trade places with anybody. And you're thankful if you have a good spouse, you came from a good family, you have health, you got it all. You got a job, you got it all. You got a Claire Marie.
That's true. So when you were 10, 12, 14 years old in Wheeling, what did you think you were going to grow up to be? Orthodontist?
I had this orthodontist working for me, J. Mark Traw, T-R-A-C-H, really a fine gentleman. And he said to me, you have nice teeth, you should be an orthodontist. I said, oh no, not me. And he dropped dead at the chair, I understand.
Really?
Yeah, he died young. I don't know why, he dropped dead. And I told you before about Dr. Messerly and getting the juice to juice that horse.
Yes.
Remember?
Yes.
Well, Dr. Tross said to me, you need to get your wisdom teeth out. So I go over to Dr. Messerly, and they're in the same building, a professional building, and he starts working on one of them. And it was tough, you know, they don't have all the stuff they have now. I'm awake, and he's cracking and drilling and cussing. And then I hear him holler at his nurse, get Traw up here. So my orthodontist, Dr. Traw, goes upstairs, and the two of them are working on me. Traw's pulling my mouth this way, Messerly's in there with elevators trying to split that molar, you know, and when they finish, you know, they finally get one out, you know. They got one out. Oh, my face half paralyzed. I go home, and I'm dark complexion. I swell up like a balloon. I swear. It was like 6 weeks for that to go down completely. 4 to 6 weeks. So then I go back and get the other one out. And then that's another 4 to 6 weeks, and that's one summer.
Yeah.
Then the next summer I go back, because I don't want to do this during school or get all messed up for school.
Right.
So I killed 2 summers almost getting wisdom teeth out. Nowadays, they'll put you to sleep. They'll take the 4 of them out, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, slick as a whistle. But you know, it's a different, you know, procedures are better, the materials are better, the people are better trained.